part 2 of the polytunnel build video. So if you haven't watched part 1, I'll put the link above my head now. So how did it do in its first year? In this video, I'm really just going to go through areas where it worked really well, areas where it didn't work as well, and things that I'm going to change for next year. I really hope it's useful if you're thinking of building your own polytunnel. But at the end of the last video, I'd built the polytunnel, but it was just empty and there was no soil in it. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the soil that we put in. Now, I built this in April and the beginning of May 2020. By the time we were ready to fill the beds with compost, we were in the full first lockdown and the garden centres were closed in that first lockdown. So we were faced with a little bit of a problem. I'd made the beds double height. So they were 2 decking boards deep, which is actually quite a lot of soil. So we ended up using a mixture of our own compost and spent compost from the things that we had growing in the greenhouse the year before, which were things like melons, cucumbers, some of the peppers, that sort of thing that we hadn't actually cleared out the greenhouse. And we ended up being able to use what was left in those pots to fill up the beds in the polytunnel. The base of the polytunnel is a weed-proof membrane, and then on top of that we built the beds straight down onto the base and they had a plastic lining. Into the bottom layer we sieve our compost, so the compost that we've made ourselves, we've got quite a lot of woody matter in there, so we always sieve it before we use it, and we used that as the base layer in the polytunnel. On top of that we put a mixture, like I say, of our own compost and spent compost. In a situation like the polytunnel where we know we're going to be feeding regularly because the tomatoes and peppers are really hungry animals, we knew that we could use spent compost because we were going to be feeding so regularly. It wasn't going to make that much of a difference. It wasn't going to be a problem. So previously in the old polytunnel, we had been growing things in a mixture of pots and grow bags. And if you think about a grow bag, it's only about this deep and you get 3 tomatoes in quite a small space. So we figured first year, a half full bed isn't going to be the end of the world. The next thing to consider was the planting layout. So it's important to think about where the light and the heat is coming from on your polytunnel. So for us, in fact, the vast majority of the heat and the sunlight is coming from the side where the door is, because that's the way the sun comes in, and behind the polytunnel is trees. So what I didn't want to do is fill either side of the door with really high plants, because they would get all the sunlight and they would block what else is happening in the polytunnel. So I wanted to have it in a sort of a tiered system. So the back wall would have the really tall stuff in, the tomatoes, and then coming round the sides. And then the front section would have the lower things like the chilies, the peppers, basil, herbs, that sort of thing. So previously, growing tomatoes in pots or whatnot, I tend to use canes. If I'm growing them outdoors and I've got actually a proper deep bed to put them in, I'll just use canes. But we had the problem that we had put such a shallow amount of soil into our compost that there was no way of anchoring a cane, so I was going to have to anchor from above, using string and wire. So what I decided to do was install wires across the top. So the first thing I needed to do was install little L hooks. So I've said it before, but I have a lot of bits and pieces in the allotment, and a lot of what went into this polytunnel was just that, bits and pieces. So the first thing I did was raid the bits and bobs drawer for some fixtures and fittings and hooks that I could put up to attach the wires to the edge of the polytunnel. I could have used hooks for this, but I didn't have any hooks. So what I ended up using was the little elbow brackets that I'd used dotted around the polytunnel to attach the battens to the frame. These were placed 2/3 back in the bed, so they were nearer the back because I was going to be needing to support the taller plants rather than the short ones that would be at the front. They were crossed over at the corner and I linked them just to give them that little extra support, and I had 2 hangers coming off the roof rafters to support the wire. So it went all the way around the outside of the polytunnel. So that first year, I was growing 17 varieties of tomato. I had a couple of each plant and I wanted to do a bit of a test of some grown outside and some grown inside. But that meant that I did need to get 17 tomato plants into that space, and they worked out perfectly. They were about 40 centimetres apart, going in a big U shape all around the edge, and it was ample space. So I said earlier I was using the string method, which means you dig your hole for your tomato and you've already attached your string to the wire above, or the cane or whatever you're using. So attached at the top, and then you've got ample at the bottom that you then pull in the bottom of the pot where the tomato is being planted, put it down and firm it in. Now, to begin with, you don't want to tie your tomatoes in because the string is actually really not anchored. You need to wait for the roots of the tomato to anchor the bottom of that string in properly before you start messing with the top of the string because it's too loose. But once you've got them in, and the plants were only yay big when I put them in, no need to tie them up. Then we had a bit of a disaster. Morning. We're up here pretty early this morning because we had a compost delivery being made. So we got 10 bags of compost, which all arrived fine, which is really nice. But let me show you what we found when we got up here this morning. Polytunnel's got lovely stab wounds in it everywhere. I've actually found the knife, I can show you. That's the knife they used. It was sticking out the wall of a shed up that way. But what I would say is it gave us a chance to test out the polytunnel repair tape. Okay, back to the tomatoes. So once they've been in there for a couple of weeks and the roots of the tomatoes have really anchored that string into their own hole, that's when you can start tying them up. Another thing, because I planted them so closely together to get the number that I needed in there, I also had to be quite on it with keeping them well trained and pruned. The tomatoes have grown so much since we got them in here, must have been a couple of weeks ago now. They're really ready for a second tie-in and a bit of a tidy up. when you are using the string method, the string, however tightly it's tied in to the root system of the plant, it will become lax, which can be a problem. So what I use is a little piece of pea cane, which I then wrap around, and then you can wind it like a winch and then just tie it at the top when the string's taut. You don't want to over tighten this because it will just pull out of the roots eventually if you keep going. But you can keep it taut all the way up for the whole growing life of the tomato in this way. So I said at the beginning, feeding was a really major factor because of the fact that we had used quite a shallow soil and a lot of it was spent compost, and also because tomatoes and peppers are incredibly hungry. So we used a comfrey feed that we make ourselves, so it didn't cost a huge amount of money. I was feeding them every 2 weeks. At the height of the season, I was feeding them every week, but it was quite a weak mix. If you're using a commercial tomato food, this can get quite expensive. So I really do recommend just putting a patch over to comfrey because it's a wonderful resource that's really underused. So my peppers were planted out much later than the tomatoes. The tomatoes were quite well established by the time my peppers were really ready to go in. I planted my peppers in a row in front, and then as my basil seedlings were coming up, I dotted them in between. So I interfilled the space with a mixture of Italian basil, Greek basil and Thai basil. In terms of how well things grew in the polytunnel this year, it was quite extraordinary. The basil particularly, we were harvesting bunches of basil like this from the polytunnel this year. The humidity and the warmth in there, it was ideal. I loved it. But in terms of tomatoes, which is the real crux, and the peppers and chilies, it was outstanding. Like I said, I grew 17 varieties of tomatoes in that polytunnel this year. If you're interested in what they were and what they tasted like, I did a Saturday special in the middle of the summer with my mum, doing a bit of a tomato tasting. But also mid-February, the vlog will have a lot about tomatoes because that's when I will be sowing them. So I'll be talking about the varieties that I grew last year, the varieties that I'm growing this year, and what's not on that front. We were picking constantly to the point where we have filled our freezer with passata, tomato soup, chopped tomatoes, and we ate tomatoes with practically every meal, salad and cooked, for the whole of the summer. It was remarkable. I think the yield was probably a third up on what we had from the previous polytunnel. We had a couple of real whoppers. I've struggled a bit in the past with some of the really big tomatoes ripening. We had no problems with that at all this year.
Look at that.
And also, obviously, peppers was another big one. Right at the beginning of the year, I'd had a bit of a disaster with some of my pepper seedlings. So I had less than I was expecting. And I was worried that we weren't going to get the quantity of peppers that we needed. But actually, not at all. It was absolutely fine. We had loads, basically. This year, I've upped the chili and pepper game massively, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so obligatory montage of tomato and pepper picking out the way. It's really, it's lovely editing that footage because it just takes me back to summer, and at the moment it's January and pretty nippy, so that's a real joy. Okay, so on to things that I'm going to do differently this year. The tomato situation, I'm not going to change at all. I was really happy with how the tomatoes grew in there. The string and wire method worked a treat. We only had one that pulled out of the ground later on in the year, but that one had a 650 gram tomato on it and it just pulled it forward a bit too much. I'm actually not going to grow the chilies and peppers in the polytunnel this year. And it's not because I wasn't happy with how they grew in there. I've also got a greenhouse, a glass one, and the situation in the two, so the polytunnel and the greenhouse, is totally different in terms of humidity and temperature fluctuation. The polytunnel that we're talking about is really humid. Hi, apologies, I am really sweaty. It is so hot in here. And the greenhouse is a much drier environment, even though I have got wood chip on the ground that I water every day in the heat of the summer. It really has a really huge temperature fluctuation in there. It gets really quite cold at night and then very hot in the day, which I didn't see in the polytunnel. And I had all of my aubergines, melons and cucumbers in the greenhouse last year, and I had a terrible time with red spider mite. Talking about the winter swap over, so that's another reason that I don't want to grow the chilies in the polytunnel again this year, is because the chilies are really slow to get going. They don't produce until sort of a good halfway through the summer, and then they carry on. I mean, I was still picking chilies in November, beginning of December, which is wonderful on the chili front, but it really messed up my scheme of getting stuff into the poly house to grow over winter. Okay, well, let's go and actually have a look what's going on in there right now at the beginning of January 2021. Yeah, so most of the stuff that's in here is really in here for spring. So yeah, this is what we have got in here at the moment. There's a lot of chard, which is coming on really nicely. And then there's what have we got? Lettuces, bits and bobs really, just bits and bobs, and some spinach, which is going to kick off really early next year as opposed to the stuff I've got outside. And this is more of the same, lucidus chard and some lettuces. What I do have to sort out is timings really, because the tomatoes carried on, and the chilies in particular just carried on all the way up till December in here. And to be honest, if I'd left them in here, the hot lemon was still producing when I cut it down. But I took them out because I wanted to have a go at growing some stuff in here for winter. And I really needed to have got that in kind of October. So my timing is a bit out. I might have to work out a way of doing that better next year. So take the tomatoes down maybe sooner, and the chilies aren't going to be in here next year, they're going to be in the greenhouse. So they were really holding up me planting stuff in the front, particularly the things like the pak choi that is in here now. We'll still get something from that, like in the spring that's going to shoot up and it's going to be perfect, but I think I would have had winter cropping if I'd been able to get the stuff in here earlier. So yeah, that's something that needs to be sorted out for next year, but having the chilies in the greenhouse instead of in here, I think will improve that. And the reason that I'm doing that isn't really for timing reasons. It's because I'm going to put the aubergines in here instead of the chilies, because the aubergines really suffered from red spider mite last year, and red spider mite really hates humidity. And it's much more humid in here than it is in the greenhouse, even with the vents open on either side. So I'm going to try it the other way around this year and see what happens with that. But it does mean that the aubergines, I'm hoping they're not going to go on as long as the chilies did. So I'll be able to get stuff in here earlier next year and have a winter crop rather than getting stuff in here ready for an early spring crop, if you see what I mean. So to get things green and lush and ready to provide over the winter period, you need to be sowing them sort of late August, September time, and then getting them into the polytunnel or wherever you're doing them kind of mid-October, early November. But I didn't have any space at that time because the chilies were still producing. And the other reason is that I am trying to overwinter a lot of my chilies this year, and I can't overwinter them in the beds because I need the beds for other things, like I was saying. So I need to have them in pots. This year I dug them up, root pruned them and got them into pots, and they're currently in the greenhouse. But next year I'm going to keep them in those pots, and the ones that I'm sowing this year are going to be kept in pots as well. Okay, so how did it stand up overall? Interesting that the stab wounds that we had right at the very start of the polyhouse's life, the poly tape has worked to treat on the outside. What I would say to anybody who has any rips like that, put a piece of poly tape on either side, because the humidity is caught in the area where the plastic is distended. It's caught in there and it's now growing green. Whereas if I had sealed it on both sides, I wouldn't have that problem. At some point, the window flaps and the door flap will need replacing. I don't expect it to be this year. They're holding out just fine for the moment, but I imagine by next winter, they're going to need a bit of help. The self-adhesive backing of the Velcro wore off pretty fast. I was expecting it to do that because it's just glue and it's just outside. But the staples are holding that fine, so that hasn't been a problem at all. We had one piece come off, but that was fixed easily. As long as you've got a stapler on hand, staples are your friend, there's no problem. But like I say, they will need to be replaced at some stage, just because they're being moved around so much more than the actual main body of the polytunnel. And where we've had them rolled up, it catches water, and again we've got the greenery problem, but a bit of a wash and that all comes off, no problem. And so yeah, that was part 2 of the polytunnel. Basically, the moral of the story is it was great. Barely anything needs changing. The only thing that I'm changing majorly for next year is where I'm planting things between the greenhouse and the poly, but that's because it always takes a year to learn what's what in a situation like this. I wasn't expecting it to be that much different from the greenhouse, but it turns out the climates that they both create inside are utterly different, both in terms of humidity and heat. I will put links to part 1 of this video in case you've watched it the wrong way round underneath. I will also put the links to the tomato tasting, and I have a video on how to sow and pot up tomatoes, which I'll also link underneath. But all of that information will be coming in the vlogs in the next month or so. So I really hope some of that information is going to be helpful to you. I don't suppose this was a massively entertaining video, but if anybody is building one of the polytunnels or something similar like I had in the other video, I just thought it was important to back it up with a bit of what I learnt over the first year and how I set mine up inside. So yeah, I hope it was useful. Like I say, vlogs every Tuesday. We're just coming up to spring. I'm about to go and sow some spring onions, which I'm really excited about, and my bedroom is currently absolutely full of chili seedlings. It's about to get fuller, I'm sure. But yeah, if you enjoyed it, please give me the thumbs up and subscribe if you're interested in seeing how this coming season goes. And just brilliant that it's about to be spring and I'm so excited. Right, yeah, I'll see you on Tuesday, guys.